Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the University of Michigan, and welcome to the Donia Center for Human Rights. My name is Steve Ratner. I'm a professor at the law school and also the faculty director of the Donia Center for Human Rights. I'm delighted to acknowledge the presence today. First, our associate director, Suan Caulfield, in the front row, and our benefactors, Bob Donia and Jane Ritter. We are delighted they made the trip from their new home in New York State to come down and join us today. We appreciate their generosity to make all these programs possible, and thanks for joining us today for a topic that I know is very important to both of you. 30 years ago, from November 1st to the 21st, at an Air Force base 200 miles south of here, right at Patterson Air Force Base outside of Dayton, Ohio, representatives of Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia gathered under the mediation efforts of the United States and other countries to try to bring an end to the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. After 3 weeks of work, they succeeded in reaching a treaty whose formal name is the General Framework Agreement for Peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was initialed at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in November and then was signed in Paris in December, and so some people also call it the Paris Agreement as well. The agreement meant to bring an end to the conflict in Bosnia by creating a new political structure composed of two entities within Bosnia, the Federation and the Republika Srpska. It included a new constitution for the country, guaranteeing observance of human rights. It included provisions for a ceasefire and military arrangements, for withdrawals of refugees, and for a stabilization force under oversight of the OSCE and of other organizations. The agreement brought an end to a war that resulted in roughly 100,000 deaths and 2 million people displaced during the war from 1991 to 1995. Famous and infamous, of course, was until the Ukraine war, the worst post-war massacre in European history, which was the execution of 8,000 Bosniak men and boys at Srebrenica. Today we are here 30 years later to look at the legacy of this agreement for Bosnia and for the region, and we're delighted to have three distinguished experts to offer their views about this compelling topic. Our panel today is unusual, or our event today is unusual and different and special in that we are going to start our event not with the comments of our three guests, but with a film entitled "The Man Who Could Not Remain Silent," from the Croatian director Nebojda Slivečević, and I apologize to my former Yugoslav colleagues around the room for mangling that. He was born in 1973 in Zagreb, graduated from the Film Directing Institute in Zagreb, and is currently teaching at the Academy of Dramatic Art in Zagreb. He's produced many films, and the film that we are about to see was the winner of the 2024 Cannes Film Festival Palme d'Or for the Best Short Film, as well as the 2024 winner of the European Film Awards European Short Film category. So the film speaks for itself. I think it will be an important start to a compelling set of observations this afternoon. So we'll dim the lights and watch the movie, and we will all move to other seats during the playing of the movie. Thanks. I will introduce our speakers as soon as the movie's over. Okay, I'm delighted to introduce our three speakers for today, and I'll introduce them in the order that they'll speak. So first, I'm delighted to welcome back to Ann Arbor Edin Hajdarpašić, who is an associate professor of history at Loyola University of Chicago. He is the author of Who's Bosnia? Nationalism and Political Imagination in the Balkans, 1840 to 1914, from Cornell Press in 2015, which won the Rothschild Book Prize in Nationalism and Ethnic Studies from the Association for the Study of Nationalities. And he writes about nationalism, imperialism, and contestations over history and memory in Southeast Europe. And we'll be looking at the Dayton Accords from a historical perspective. Our second speaker will be Valery Perry, who's a senior associate at the Democratization Policy Council, who has made the trip from Sarajevo to join us this afternoon. She's worked in the Western Balkans since the 1990s, working for the Policy Council, as well as the European Center for Minority Issues, the NATO Stabilization Force in Bosnia, and NGOs. She's also worked for the OSCE missions to both Bosnia and Serbia, and has taught courses at the Sarajevo School of Science and Technology. She's published numerous articles and book chapters and has spoken at conferences in the U.S. and Europe. She's also the creator of her first documentary film called Looking for Dayton, which was screened at this 26th Sarajevo Film Festival. And our third speaker will be Tatjana Papić, who is a professor of international law and international human rights law at the Union University of Belgrade. And she's currently an international and comparative law senior research scholar here at our law school. She's also a visiting scholar at the University of Reading, at the University of Milano, and has previously was the head of the legal department at the esteemed NGO, the Belgrade Center for Human Rights. Her research is focused on international law, human rights, and the intersection between international law and domestic politics, and she's published in all of the leading journals in international law, as well as serving as a visiting professor at a number of law schools. So we couldn't have a better group to enlighten us this afternoon. Each of our speakers will speak for roughly 12 minutes, maybe a few minutes more, and then we will move into comments and questions. So Edin, we're delighted to have you start. If you could just pull the mic closer to you. And there's a little switch there to turn it on. I should also mention there are bathrooms, but the ones on this floor seem to be under repair, so you need to go either up to one or down to one or up to three to find that, but they are not too far. That's just my phone, probably another 855 number that they keep calling me many times a day, and so I forgot to turn it off, but it will stop. Okay. Edin, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ratner. Thank you, Steve, for inviting me. It's really wonderful to be back in Ann Arbor. It made me remember when I was a graduate student here. Is this needed, or do I need to speak up?
Yeah,
okay.
It's recorded.
It's for the recording. For posterity's sake, you need to know that I was here in the year 2000, and I was invited to be an interpreter at the diplomatic symposium at Dayton for the 5th anniversary. In 2000, and it really feels surreal to be speaking at the 30th anniversary of Dayton. It made me think how much my own life has been shaped by that pact and by the war which it ended. And for my remarks, I wanted to maybe take some time and think critically about that past. So I'll take my 12 minutes now. Last month, a new legal investigation was announced in Milan, Italy. It is examining long-standing reports that some Italians, alongside French, German, and other foreigners, paid money to join the Serb forces besieging Sarajevo in the 1990s, and from their positions in the mountains around the city, kill civilians below. The Milan investigation news swept global media. Amid mounting outrage, a Republican congresswoman in D.C. called for further investigations, inquiring whether any Americans took part in the murder schemes in 1990s Bosnia. I was 15 years old when the Serb forces besieged Sarajevo, my hometown. While my mother, my brother, and I were able to get out, we became separated from my father, who lived with the threat of sniping and shelling for 4 years and survived the siege. We reunited in the U.S. To many Bosnians, the news from Milan seems old because the presence of foreign volunteers, specifically in the Serbian ranks, was well known and documented. The Russian intellectual and politician Eduard Limonov traveled from St. Petersburg to have himself filmed in Sarajevo hillsides, firing guns into the city and talking poetry with the Serb leader Radovan Karadzic. YouTube has multiple clips of this with hundreds of thousands of views. Volunteers from Greece took part in the Srebrenica mass murders. After Radovan Karadzic was internationally indicted for genocide and went into hiding, the French presidential candidate Jean-Marie Le Pen secretly arranged to travel to Serbia to meet with him. So picture the scene, two European politicians talking shop, even in hard times. This was the result not of one side lobbying, but of a genuine mutual synergy of different factions recognizing a part of themselves in each other and forging symbolic and material connections on the terrain of wartime Bosnia. Even decades after the war, far-right extremists explicitly invoked Radovan Karadzic and Bosnian Serb leaders as some of their idols as they carried out anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant atrocities from Utoya, Norway in 2011 to Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019. The Italians now being investigated in Milan may have been wealthier than others, but if they came to the Serb positions around Sarajevo, they were a part of that transnational network since the 1990s. Its loose patchwork did not constitute a single party, but it did mobilize around a common worldview, a kind of a crusader ideology in which they depicted themselves as Christians defending the West from menacing Muslim intruders. It's a worldview repeated in more polite terms by Samuel Huntington in The Clash of Civilizations, the most popular academic text to emerge out of the 1990s and one obsessed with the war in Bosnia. All this was and remains well known. Jean Baudrillard, the French theorist and inspiration behind the Matrix movie, even wrote about it in the 1990s. But the prevailing liberal consensus told a different story. After the end of the Cold War, it was more comforting to focus on feel-good stories and minimize the disturbing ones. In a strategy of disassociation, it felt more comforting to take the examples I just outlined separately and dismiss each one as an individual excess or aberration, as if they were a bunch of unconnected stories that, aside from the occasional but recurring mass murder of Muslims, did not amount to anything until they did. Now that we live in a world where the forces of that transnational right are globally empowered, we must have the courage to look back on the history of the 1990s war and on Dayton with different eyes than before. And that's a really tall undertaking. I'm not doing it myself. I think we'll talk about it as a panel. But part of that reckoning starts with restating what drove Yugoslavia and Bosnia into war by the 1990s. To cut to the heart of the matter, the gist of the war in Bosnia was a political project seeking to territorially separate different communities in order to create spaces of national purity, whether through proposed population exchanges or through mass violence and genocide. And my aim here is not to recite a familiar chronology, but to outline some of the aims and logics of that kind of state-making. So here I'll try to give a very brief account. Before the war erupted in 1992, Bosnia was a part of Yugoslavia, a state that was recreated from the ground up from the wreckage of World War II. Freed by the communist resistance, the new Yugoslavia blazed not only its new path to socialism separate from the Soviet model, but also had to address the Nazi occupation and the genocide led by the Croatian fascists known as the Ustaše. On the whole, Yugoslavia strove to preserve the centuries-long fusions of different national and religious communities in this part of the world. As a federation of 6 republics, it proclaimed a policy of brotherhood and unity among Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, Slovenes, Macedonians, and others, though Albanians and Kosovo were always seen as potentially unassimilable and therefore repressed. And those Yugoslav dynamics were precisely what some nationalists reframed. Since the late 1960s, Some former communists started to claim that Yugoslavia was an unfair arrangement, not to the smallest, but to the largest group, the Serbs. According to politicians like Ćosić, the Serbs had one titular state in Serbia, yet they were the driving force in creating Yugoslavia, only to find themselves as minorities in Croatia, Bosnia, and especially in Kosovo. So by the 1980s, Serbian nationalists were claiming that they were facing extinction in Kosovo because Albanians were, quote unquote, outbreeding them, thus replacing and erasing the Serbs. They said this was a quiet genocide, and yes, they did use the G word in the 1980s, and the parallels with discourses of white genocide and great replacement are apparent today. It's worth underlining the key allegation here that the dominant ethnic group was actually the most endangered one and had to act accordingly, as if it were facing an existential war for its own survival. With the rapid fall of communism in the late 1980s, nationalists of all stripes seized a wave of unpredictable change to sow fear and create conditions for such wars. And that war would have to redraw national borders in order to make people and territory one and the same. One territory for one people. Any others living on it would be either expelled or killed. Better to have a pitiful little state and a deeply impoverished one just for your kind than to suffer the indignity of living with those different from you. That was the kind of logic of Ćosić, whose political tide rose along with Slobodan Milošević and Radovan Karadzic in the late 1980s and 1990s. Such men tore Yugoslavia apart, focusing with special ferocity on Bosnia and Herzegovina, the most communally diverse republic. In the film you just watched, you can see what the project of national separation looked like in practice, down to individuals being taken off trains and murdered. While Serb and Croat nationalists fought over dividing lines between themselves, they also shared the view that there was no space for Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks in either of their statelets. Mass murder of Muslim neighbors were justified by depicting them as deceptive Islamic radicals just biding their time for some kind of a Sharia takeover. It was, in short, a convergence of genocidal projects that plunged Bosnia into a complex 4-year-long war. And yes, the American intervention in Dayton did end the war in 1995. Dayton was the triumph of the doctrine of lesser evilism, a favorite liberal strategy of centrist deferral. At Dayton, Richard Holbrooke himself said, 90% of negotiations concerned the map and the territory, and whatever little time was left was spent on constitutional and institutional details. Today, the situation is different. Bosnia remains in peace that was forged in Dayton. But the ideologies, the ideas that tore it apart in the 1990s have continued to evolve. Today, Serb and Croat nationalists, as well as their global allies, spent 90% of their time devising legalistic and institutional ways of dividing up peoples and territories. But the aim remains the same, making common communal life impossible, with each side getting its own ethnically pure statelet. But let's be careful about the Muslims, they say. So here's a little test. Who said the following? Bosnian Muslims want, I quote, an unattainable centralized state amid endless communal entanglements that feeds Islamic radicalism. Is it Serb or Croat nationalists in 1995? Or is it the Heritage Foundation officials and co-authors of Project 2025? It's the latter. The truth is, these were distinct but never entirely separate movements, cutting across the Balkans and the United States. As someone who lived through the 1990s and is now living through the 2000s, 2020s, 21st century is a mess. Reflecting on the wave of nationalist mobilizations, my overarching sense is one of simple refusal to accept these ideas and to accept that worldview. I think one of the great tragedies of our time is that so many people in Yugoslavia and now in America have been browbeaten or have given into imagining the world in such small, demeaning, spiritually, materially impoverished ways. Yet many also refuse to give up, and they do speak up, as you saw in the film. And that, I think, is the basic minimum that we can demand when we speak about what's happening in Dayton, in Bosnia, as well as America today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Edin, for your introductory remarks. And we'll turn to Valery now.
Great. Thank you. And thank you so much for bringing me to Michigan for this. It was worth the flight, and I'm sure it's going to be a good conversation. I'm glad that Edin is contextualizing this within the framework of everything we're seeing happening in the United States today. Because I think that for a number of years, I think there was a mistaken sense that the wars of dissolution in the former Yugoslavia were like the last gasp of the Cold War, when actually it was the first breath of what was going to be following after that, when you would look at some of the geopolitical, economic, global trends. And a lot of sociologists were looking at that, but people didn't want to see it because it also happened at the same time as what you can call really peak liberal, international liberal interventionism, which had a short-lived history that was very important for Bosnia, Kosovo, and some other places, and we've now started to see the decline. I was in Dayton for the 20-year anniversary, and it seems like every 5 years there's an anniversary that somebody's going to talk about what's going on. And I think it's notable that nothing happened this year at 30. Some of the people who organized the conference at 20, they're like, you know, we don't want to give a platform to these same politicians who have done absolutely nothing to move things forward. And I think they were right. They talked about having some students there to try to have a more forward-looking agenda. And some of us are still talking with them about doing something moving forward. But the notion of having a big event with the elites who don't want change just didn't seem right. I want to talk about what Dayton did and didn't do, some of the lessons we could learn for Ukraine and elsewhere, and then try to look at what some of this means in terms of the end of the liberal democratic peace, including for the countries that we thought were consolidated democracies. So what did Dayton do? I mean, again, this was peak comprehensive security, peak liberal visions of peace and human rights. And when you look at it, even though there were a lot of flaws, it stopped the war. It established the notion of a right to return, which, I mean, again, can't really be underestimated. It was imperfect. We all know that, but it was in there. And it's notable that that wasn't even in the 28 points that we saw coming out from Putin and his buddies. The Constitution and the annexes are grounded in and reference human rights conventions, democratic norms. It expected that there'd be a country in Europe in the future. So all of these transatlantic notions were embedded in there. Again, were they perfectly implemented? No, but they were in there. There was a moment in time when people believed this, and even if they didn't believe that the warlords believed it themselves, they pushed them to sign it. There was actually an annex about protecting cultural heritage. There was a recognition that so much cultural heritage had been destroyed because of the ethnic cleansing that, you know what, we should try to preserve and protect it. That was in there. That's pretty rare. And also, war crimes. I mean, was the prosecution of war crimes perfect? No. But the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia did put a lot of war criminals in jail. A lot of them got out, but a lot of them have died while they've been there. And very importantly as well, it established an archival record of what happened, which is extremely important at a time now where we see that historical revisionism and trying to rewrite the past and trying to sell lies to people is on the upswing. So having this archive is extremely important. What were some of the mistakes? I mean, I could give a litany of those as well, but a couple of the ones that really come to mind for me is that it really did not have a time frame for trying to move on to something better. When the Dayton Agreement was signed, there was a sense that, look, this is the floor and not the ceiling. Things will move forward. We can fix the problems. Everyone was aware of what the problems were with the Constitution, for example, because the Constitution limited full civic rights to only people who were Bosniaks, Croats, or Serbs. It completely left out Roma, Jews, others, people who just didn't want to identify. And that is still being litigated today. And unfortunately, so much time has passed without that being properly litigated. We're seeing rights in other European countries drop to the level we're seeing in Bosnia. We also didn't see a plan to have citizens be involved in any of these issues. Everything was imposed on the citizens. There was no referendum, and there was never an actual civic discourse about the kind of constitution and the kind of society people would have wanted to have. So yeah, it wasn't perfect. There were mistakes, but it did end the war. And 30 years later, the war has not started again, though a lot of the politicians are pursuing war by different means. A lot of times people ask me, what were the 2 or 3 biggest mistakes since the end of the war? And I always have to come back to 2 structural and important social political issues, one being the election law. There was an election law that was put into place in about 2000 or 2001. There was an opportunity at that time to put in an election law that would have helped to minimize polarization, minimize radicalization, and try to force politicians to campaign and also then serve based on more moderate politics that would cross ethnic lines. The OSCE and others actually received proposals for election systems that could have done this. They ignored them all. They went with the first past the post, which was exactly what the extremists wanted, and you know what? It worked. We can learn lessons from that when we look at gerrymandering in this country and different tools that actually incentivize politicians to pander to their worst instincts, and those are their constituents. The second thing I would mention would be education, because education was not included in the Dayton Agreement. And what we've seen consistently is that education has been used as a way to try to brainwash the next generation of young people into nationalists who will not question corruption, will not question why leaders are not delivering, but will just believe that it's absolutely impossible for them to learn, study, live, and work with the other. And unfortunately, that's been highly successful as well. There have been a lot of efforts to try to reform the education system in the country, but they've always been at the project level. They've happened here and there and here and there, while the system remains rotten and divisive. And about 15 years ago, I remember a politician noting, in a private conversation, that the purpose of the education was to create little ethnic soldiers. And you know what? That's what's happening. And again, I think we can learn about that when we look at the United States right now. It's not for nothing that education is being attacked, whether it's higher education or education at the elementary school level. Citizens who have critical thinking skills are going to ask questions. Citizens who don't are going to sit back and watch wrestling. Next, lessons for Ukraine and elsewhere. I think it's extremely important to remember that we need to marginalize the spoilers. You need the warlords. You need them to get to peace. But then you need to get them out of this. You got to get rid of them. You need to not embed them because their appetites aren't going to go away. People who get involved in these endeavors are not going to be satisfied with suddenly being in a parliament where there's checks and balances. And we've seen this consistently. And we've seen that when we back different politicians within a broken system that really incentivizes polarization and division, politicians fall to the lowest common denominator available there so that they can survive in that political system. There's different ways you can try to do this. You can pay them off, you can incarcerate them, or you can find a way to permanently make sure that they lose at the polls, which brings us back to education and electoral systems and rules. It's also extremely important to remember that when you're looking at peace deals, and this is something important for Ukraine, it's really easy and it's really tempting to say, you know what, we're just going to put this in place for the interim. It won't stay there forever. But the interim becomes permanent unless you keep the will and the incentives to move things forward. You can see this in a host of different things in Bosnia, one of which is, again, education. 20 years ago, this thing called 2 schools under one roof, where Catholics study here and Muslims study here in the same building, was set up and was called an interim solution. 20 years later, we still have it. Because you know what? The politicians don't want to change it. Neither of them do. They want to keep their little ethnic soldiers being educated. And so, again, it might seem good to sort of put this in place at one point, but moving forward, it will take root. And as it takes root, the structure of the conflict changes. The way Bosnia looks, the way the conflict looks and feels today is different than it was 35 years ago, because you have a generation of people who have grown up in these systems who don't remember the common life that their parents remember. And this is troubling. I haven't given up on this generation, but it's a different basket of challenges. Also, when looking at Ukraine, we need to think, who are the West's real partners in this? Is it the elites who came to the bargaining table just because they were forced to by threats of airstrikes or sanctions? Or is it citizens and people who actually want something better? How do we involve citizens more in these processes so that they're actually vested in this? And we're not very good at this. I don't know if we'll be talking about this next, but there has been a fantastic student protest in Serbia by young people who have been demonstrating against the corrupt kleptocracy that they've been growing up in for all these years. The European Union has been almost silent on this. And this is shameful because that's actually the true values-based constituency Brussels should be talking to, not the people in power who are seeking to continue to divide. And so the sooner we can start finding out who our real allies are, the better. Finally, and I'm conscious of the time, when we're thinking about the end of the liberal and the democratic peace, we need to start hurrying. Exactly what Edin said is true. Right now, we're seeing that the forces on the right, the forces of division, and the forces of control and manipulation, they're ascendant. They're well-funded, they have a communication strategy, and they're all working from the same song sheet. Where's the other side? Right now, we can no longer count on the United States on this. We can see that the idea of a transatlantic relationship has been shattered right now. And even if there's a change in the midterms, and even if there's a new president in a few years, there's no trust. You have no idea how much the trust level has dropped just in the past 11 months. And so Europe needs to see that, but they have not yet. There's an opportunity to do so. My colleagues and I at DPC, we're trying to talk to people and say, we need to build Europe Plus. Europe, Canada, Switzerland, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, all of the democracies who recognize that they and their citizens do not want to live in an authoritarian state. And yet they're not coordinating, they're not well funded. The funding that was lost from USAID has not been replaced. And so how do we get to that, and how do we get people as motivated as the people on the right have been? And then looking at really just in terms of a conclusion on this one, there is something big and geopolitical happening right now, and we can see it. And it's the right that really does have confidence that what they're doing is right. The run fast and break things approach is working. And we're seeing right now that when we look at the 28 points that were presented as a peace plan for Ukraine, which again was just a Russian wish list, that's the complete opposite of what we had seen at Dayton. The Dayton points were imperfect, but it actually spoke to a vision and an ideal that back then people thought they could work towards. What we're seeing right now on paper is almost a sense that everyone wants to give up. And so watching to see how these things move forward, watching to see how we see Russia react on this, the United States, and especially Europe and Europe Plus, is going to tell us a lot more about whether or not peace agreements in the future are going to look more like those 28 points or more like what we saw at Dayton, which was imperfect, but at least gave some sort of an idealistic vision. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Valery. And Tatjana.
Oh, I can use this one. Hvala ti, Edin. Okay, so my mission is to wrap up this first round of our talks to you before we start discussing and commenting with giving you an overview of the legacy of Dayton from the perspective of Serbia, a neighboring country that was heavily involved in the Balkan Wars. And let me start with saying that this legacy of Dayton Agreement, which testifies of its time, as Ukrainian deal testifies of these times, or Gaza ceasefire agreement, there are different times. These former two seem transactional, Dayton peace agreement seeming as transposing some liberal values Valery already talked about. So with this agreement in mind, viewing on it and on its legacy from Serbia, one can say that on the one hand, Serbia supports Dayton as a key pillar of regional stability, and it supports Bosnia and Herzegovina's sovereignty. At the same time, it also builds very strong relationship with one of the entities, Republika Srpska, and at the same time uses identity politics and nationalistic narratives for the purposes of domestic political gains within this broader framework of the legacy of the Balkan Wars. And my idea is to give you a chronological brief overview how these approaches changed during the times in Serbia and what, in a way, influenced them. And I will start with Milosevic, one of the signatories of the Dayton peace agreement. Of course, at that time, in November 1995 or in December, when Dayton-Paris agreement was signed in Paris, this was marked as like a watershed moment because bloodshed was over. And Milosevic and his cronies were trying to depict Dayton as their diplomatic success. And they, in a way, succeeded in that because international sanctions eased. In a way, his government was more integrated, while still on the margins, but more integrated into international community. But the view on Dayton was some sort of a mixture of like pragmatic acceptance and political calculation with a little bit of twist of nationalistic narratives, I also need to add. So the main discourse in public was, okay, the war is over, and that is the good news. Dayton is like a triumph of peace. But at the same time, you had these nationalistic camps that were seeing Dayton. They were not that vocal, but still they were present, that this is a betrayal of greater ideas of all Serbs living in a single country, or some more radical ideas within this nationalistic camp of like expanding Serbian state. So when 2000 came, in fall of 2000, Milosevic fell and his regime, and we got ourselves a new democratic government that wanted to change the paradigm of the way the state has run and how it positioned itself in the world. So they basically started reconstructing everything that Milosevic destroyed during the 90s, which included introducing liberal values, work on the rule of law, fixing devastated economy with this international sanctions, but also trying to reestablish Serbia as a legitimate part of international community. And then, in that sense, also Dayton plays an important role, because this official line of support for Dayton was reiterated in a way that back in 2001, Dayton was ratified in Serbia. It was enforced because by the virtue of the signatures, it was enforced, and Milosevic acted upon it back in the 1996 to extradite a person to the Hague Tribunal, but it was not a part of the Serbian legal system. So these new democratic authorities, they decided to integrate Dayton into our domestic legal order, and in a way to say a signal to international community that they're not there to undermine Dayton, and that they still support this special relationship that Serbia tends to build with Republika Srpska. And there comes a very funny story. I mean, it's not funny, it's a peculiar story. When people initiated, when they decided that they will ratify Dayton Peace Agreement, they were trying to prepare papers for the ratification. And they couldn't find an official version that Milosevic brought home with him. Archives, all governmental departments, there was not a single paper or a copy of this agreement. So French people had a few originals to spare, so they have sent one to new Serbian government, and on the basis of that copy or original that French had, the ratification process was initiated. So it was very important for the democratic government to send this kind of a message. We ratified it while it's, as I told you, in force. At the same time, they were like formalizing relationship with Republika Srpska. There was this 2006 special parallel ties agreement with Republika Srpska that emphasized this relations that they have, and in a way an effort of Serbia to take care of Serbian identity across its borders. Then comes into the picture something that we also saw in a movie and that both Valery and Edin shared, and that is the legacy of the wars in the Balkans. While the Dayton Peace Agreement required cooperation with the Hague Tribunal, broader international obligations stipulated that Serbia needs to cooperate with the Hague Tribunal. And within this incorporation into international community, Serbian government needed to cooperate in order to be a legitimate actor in international relations and in order to really support its claim that it wants to be a part of the EU, right? But at the same time, it had to balance all the time with these nationalistic camps that were saying like, oh, the Hague Tribunal, it's a victim's justice. And then comes all this victimization, grievance narratives that you can find in our part, my part of the world. So, and now, I mean, you see this victimization narrative also in your part of the world, but, you know, that's how, unfortunately, things go. I mean, you get the picture that it's not directly the Dayton's legacy, but it's a war's legacy that shaped the way Serbia views on Bosnia and Herzegovina and how it actually abuses its political elites are abusing at a time, which you will see in this final period that I will talk about now. That period starts, in 2012, when nationalists dressed in EU values gowns appear and win elections. And they are gaining control step by step over the whole state and society, silencing dissent, silencing independent media, completely disregarding checks and balances, completely ruining some sort of democratic consolidation we had in these 12 years since the fall of Milosevic. As Valery said, EU is bystander for the sake of stabilocracy or stability in the Balkans, with the eye on Bosnia, but not only on Bosnia and Herzegovina, but there is another burning issue related to Serbia, and that is Kosovo. They are supporting this kind of, by their silence, by this, they are supporting this democratic backsliding, in which we also hear this official line of the support for Dayton. We also do not hear, fortunately, a support for Dodik's secessionist claims that Republika Srpska should be independent. Serbian government never openly endorsed that policy. But you also see building a closer ties, maybe not with an entity of Republika Srpska or Serbian people in Republika Srpska, but the ruling elites of Republika Srpska. And that connection is far stronger than it was before, in my mind. It's used for domestic, very pragmatic political gains. I will give you an example. In the last local elections back in summer 2024, you had buses of voters from Republika Srpska being brought to Serbia to vote on the local election so that a ruling party can stay in power. Also, you see the use of memory politics, identity politics, these narratives on the war every time they are needed. Back in 2024, there was an effort in the United Nations General Assembly that ultimately succeeded to adopt Srebrenica Remembrance Resolution. Serbia was vehemently opposing that effort and trying to picture that effort as something that was aimed to punish only poor Serbs. And if you would be in Belgrade at that time, you would see billboards, and Steve can testify to that. You could see billboards that would say, Republic of Serbia and Srpska are united, and you would not get a clue what it was all about. And it was about that resolution that was trying to mark this genocide that was framed within the domestic narrative as something that was targeting only Serbs, so playing this nationalistic card. And that was all for the sake of the elections that were taking place at that very time. So deflecting, completely deflecting the attention of the electorate. So to conclude, you see this dichotomy of official line supporting formally Dayton, supporting this autonomy of Republika Srpska, but then again, you see also Dayton as some sort of a strategic tool for domestic political ends. And Valery touched upon that in her talk, what would it take to, in a way, change this? I would agree education is a key. But then again, without political leadership who wants to invest in that and shift educational process in that regard, we cannot achieve much. The study of the work of the Hague Tribunal, there were a lot of surveys done by the Belgrade Center for Human Rights at the time when I was working there. We were tracking the attitudes of people in both Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia, and later in Kosovo, toward the work of the Hague Tribunal. And you see clear divide along the ethnic lines on the approach to the ICTY, which resemble identities of an ethnic group. So if a Hague Tribunal reached a decision against a Croatian person, people from Croatia would have the same attitude toward the Hague Tribunal as Serbs would be if the verdict was against a Serbian national. So you see that this is like this nationalism virus that unfortunately seems to be spreading around the world. And when I now read about the United States and see all the different narratives here, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is like a Twilight Zone. Like the worst nightmare of my youth is something that now appears here in the beacon of freedom that we were like watching the US being. So. To wrap up, I think that the examples of a man who you saw in a movie, his name is Tomo Buzov. He was, as you saw, an officer of a Yugoslav National Army of Croatian origin, but he lived in Belgrade. There is a small town in Dalmatia which has a pier dedicated to him. And there is also a plaque in my hometown, Belgrade, on the building he lived in, which says that he lived there, that a person who was brave and humane lived there. That plaque was removed for a while. It was erected back in 2016, and at some point in 2022 it was removed, but people gathered and put it back. So these kind of examples can be used to shift the education and to change this nationalistic narratives. But my fear is that this virus might be transgenerational, but at the same time, these students' protests in my home country bring me some hope that it might not be the case, because you see this cross-national narratives of values that they are preaching for very dominantly, regardless of which group you are actually belonging to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatjana. Okay, we can now move to a discussion, and I would just like to start that by identifying one theme that all three of our panelists seem to talk about. And I'd like to sort of ask for some further thoughts on it from each of them. You all, I think, in different ways, talked about external interest in former Yugoslavia, or in Bosnia in particular, as occasionally positive, such as what happened at Dayton. But then, Edin, you emphasized how the transnational aspect is often very pernicious, with sort of global nationalist movements who played a role actually in the massacres. And Valery, you talked about outsiders being neutral at best in the case of the EU, with its lack of support for democratic protests in Serbia. So I'm trying to sort of, I'd be interested in hearing more from you as to whether you think outside actors can or should play a positive role, or whether they are actually going to make things worse because of transnational nationalist movements, for instance, so that it would be better to sort of let the people of Bosnia and former Yugoslavia figure this out on their own. So where do you see a positive role, if any, for outside actors, in particular in light of the clear lack of U.S. interest on this issue, U.S. governmental interest. So, do you have thoughts on that?
Should I go first?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
I'll try to be brief. Perhaps as a historian, I guess thinking about countries in our part of the world, whether it's Yugoslavia or Bosnia or many Balkan states, they are small states. We don't really have the luxury of not thinking about the rest of the world historically. That's one of the greatest shocks. So when I came to the U.S., how little American historians inquired about the rest of the world. And then it's changed, and of course now like history departments have America and the world like programs, and that's a relatively recent thing. I don't think that there's anything inherently there's an inherent characteristic that's negative, positive, or neutral about outsiders in any of these places. I think it's a fact of life in the Balkans. I think it's more to the latter part of your question about the present day situation, in which we really have, in places like Bosnia, already for many years, effectively a multipolar world order. I know that this is something that maybe people are talking about in the U.S. So is it emerging, or should it be a desirable thing? Go live in Syria; it's a multipolar world order. Go live in Bosnia; that's a multipolar world order. It sucks. And for the most part, unless you're extremely rich or well connected to, Russian interests, which are present in the region, which we didn't talk much about, but they're there. There are interests of China as well, much less so, but still apparent. A huge surge in the last decade of interest from the Gulf countries economically, investments in Serbia and Bosnia, buying up land, development, all sorts of shady deals with politics that are inscrutable but largely anti-democratic. And then there is the EU and the US, which Valery talked about, how little those places that used to depict themselves as upholders of this liberal world order have actually done. I think the US situation is obvious in the last 10 years with the rise of Trump, what has happened. But really, the situation of the EU is different, and it is something that is just profoundly dispiriting to have an entirely wealthy continent of 500 million people sitting on incredible resources and prestige. And in the 1990s, they would bite their nails and say, should we do something about this killing on our doorstep? Oh my gosh, why can't we? Why could we? Or should we? And then the same thing is happening today, and it's frankly pathetic. Maybe for Europeans, it's a debate that they're having. But get over yourselves, look at yourselves in the mirror. It really is pathetic not to stand up for what you say you believe in. And that's, I think, EU in a nutshell. Not maybe at the current moment, sometimes they do show up and it's like, yeah, great. And then they go back in their shell.
Yeah, I don't know, actually. I don't know the answer. That would be the easiest way to say. But I think that we have to, let me put it this way. I would prefer an outside, I can't say meddling, but an impetus from outside and a pressure. I mean, these people have been locked for 3 weeks, right, in the air naval base in Dayton, and been forced to reach the agreement once the great powers or the US decided there needs to be a peace. And I would prefer to have that kind of order around, which is liberal, which corresponds to my values, personal values, to have a say. But I would be very skeptical of foreign meddling into that in a transactional kind of diplomacy the U.S. currently is dealing with, not paying attention to the basic stuff that are incorporated in the Dayton Peace Agreement, let alone individuals who are the leaders of these countries in the future. So my position on that is ambivalent. I mean, it depends what international community wants to do, and what is international community. I mean, to be frank, to be in a way more mild to Europeans, it's hard to be a European at this particular moment, being constantly marginalized and sounding in a way even strange by repeating liberal values and multilateralism and preaching for these things that we know. And then all of a sudden, like China, Russia, and the States seem completely different. So the EU now, I mean, globally, seems like a beacon of these liberal freedoms we are all for, obviously, and I would like to see much more of their involvement, but still they're marginalized. And the way you see how they redrafted 28 points for Ukraine, you see how this changes the picture, even in that very simple kind of way of finishing the war in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. Valery?
Sure. I mean, I don't think there's any chance that outsiders are going to leave the region alone. I mean, because they're just not going to. Because you're either going to have Russia coming in, and either, I mean, they've already done this. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about is some of the ideological links between Russia and Serbia. Ruski mir, which is one of the ideologies that has been undergirding the war in Ukraine, has a corollary in Srpski svet, in the Serbian world. And you can see this in terms of some of the far-right intellectual thinkers, etc., and it's corrosive in that sense. So that kind of influence is also happening. I mean, Russia's not spending a ton of money, but what they do is they can spend a small amount of money and get a lot of bang for the buck because of the propaganda machine that already exists in Serbia through the media. You've got China coming into the region and investing a lot of times in mines and hydroelectric projects without any regard to what Europe would expect in terms of environmental compliance, transparency, anti-corruption. And it's had devastating effect on some of the water systems, et cetera. And yet they're able to find local politicians who are happy to make these deals because they're probably getting a cut. So I mean, so Europe is struggling with this, and I agree with the criticisms entirely. They're playing a good hand poorly, consistently, over all of this time. Europe is not really coming in. They'll say, oh, but we need to come in and start exploiting the lithium. We need to come in and start exploiting the nickel or the silver, et cetera, in these mines. Because if we don't do it, the Russians or Chinese will. And it's like, well, okay. First of all, it shouldn't be a given that some outsider is going to exploit what should be the birthright of the people in Bosnia, in Serbia, et cetera. And if you are going to come in with your German or your Swiss or your British firm, or there's a big mining project about 30 minutes outside of Sarajevo that's been changing hands all the time, and now it's owned by Canadians, but a lot of American private equity. And it's like, well, the starting point shouldn't be you're going to be exploited. The starting point should be, what do you have, and how can we make sure that any investment or development, doesn't make the democratic quality even worse? But how can we use this as an actual investment to try to develop things? How can we use this to sort of strengthen the rule of law related to corruption, to ensure compliance today with environmental regulations that would be taken as required in Stockholm or in Austria or someplace? Well, unfortunately, the European Union right now seems to want almost the worst of both worlds in terms of pretending that the region has a European Union future, pretending that they're going to keep having all of these different summits, et cetera, but not wanting to apply the actual human rights standards and values-based standards to the region today that would be necessary to move things forward. And so the longer you've got this broken system, the more and more these corrupt practices sort of embed and erode the quality of democracy. And so it's a real missed opportunity in that point. You've got another challenge as well, though, in terms of, I mean, again, the European Union's own schizophrenia nowadays, in terms of whether or not the balance of power within the European Union is indeed shifting more towards like the vision of Europe that Orban wants to have. I mean, that's a Trojan horse for the right. So we shouldn't be surprised when we hear, that Viktor Orban will constantly say that he thinks Serbia should get in immediately. Of course he does, because he wants another guy at the table screwing things up with the people who actually want to talk about liberal rights and values. And so Europe has not figured out how to deal and how to sort of mature its own institutional processes, decision making, etc., in a way that can make sure that one country does not sort of throw everything else off balance. Now, is Hungary the only problem? No, there's other ones as well. But right now, they're the ones that really, and again, the right wingers in the United States. Vance looks, I mean, that whole circle look to Hungary right now for this white Christian nationalism vision.
Germany.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so we see this consistently. And so, I mean, they're not going to be left alone. I guess the main question is, how can they have more say in what's happening to them as opposed to just being passive?
Thank you. Thank you for each of your perspectives on that. Okay, so we have quite a bit of time for discussion, questions. If you could just identify yourself and. Yes, and I think I recognize someone in the front row. And just say who you are, and we will look forward to the questions. And we can dispense with one of the mics for the speaker. So, Bob, if you'd like.
Thanks. I think I know pretty much everybody here, but I'm Bob Donia. I first went to Bosnia in 1964 and was smitten and in a sense haven't left since, but my first trip there was a real revelation. It's the first time I'd been in a country like that, and it was like discovering the gritty, nitty-gritty reality of life that most of the world lived for a kid who grew up in a sheltered environment of southwestern Michigan. But I'd like to just tell you about one visit that I made later, which was to Tuzla in about 1996, January of 1996, which was just 5 months after the Srebrenica genocide. And a friend that I was visiting in Tuzla and I decided that we wanted to visit some of the refugees from Srebrenica who were housed in an elementary school there in Tuzla. The second floor was still devoted to elementary school classes. The first and third floors were devoted to quarters for refugees. And on those floors, there were 5 rooms each and about 30 refugees in each home with these large bunk beds that accommodate 2, top and bottom. And each room had a very different tenor to it. And the room that was, the first room we went into had a maybe 17-year-old girl and an older woman and a bunch of other people, and one man who was on the top bunk who was weeping prodigiously the entire time I was there. And our hostess, a woman who was showing us through, said he lost all 4 of his sons at Srebrenica, and his wife perished as well. And she said, he has been like this since July. This was January. Well, obviously our attentions were focused on him, but then looking around at the other inhabitants of this room, they're going crazy. This guy is just weeping constantly, and you can see them cringing and saying, we get it. We're really, really sorry you lost your 4 sons, but would you please shut up? And so I had kind of learned from a previous experience that the one thing, if you ask people, what can I do for you in that situation, they tend to say, just be here. Be with us. Your being here is what's important. And so I shook this gentleman's hand, and he took it, and we stood there for maybe a minute or two. And there was nothing more to do or say. We just finished our handshake and walked away. What could be done? Nothing. There is nothing that a human being could possibly do that could assuage that grief and that cry for justice. But you gotta try. And I'll tell you, in the years since that first visit to Bosnia 60 years ago, I can't tell you what it is. And I've tried all sorts of things, none of which has worked perfectly, and some of which have kind of worked. And I've got these 4 people on this panel who, and many of you others in the audience, who have done various things and tried various things to do that and had some real success. But the important thing is they've been dedicated to doing it and trying. And that's kind of where I come down on the answer to that question that was raised. What do you do? I can't tell you. And I don't think that anybody can. The only thing I can say to you is get engaged and stay engaged and be what the anthropologists call a participant observer. Stay engaged, and something will come up that will lead you to do something that's going to make a difference. That was kind of the way I was engaging with the tribunal before my brief career as a witness started. And I mean, I'm an American historian. I struggle with the language. I struggle with mastering the history of Bosnia every day. And there were probably 50 people that were better qualified than I was to be the historian called in to present a history of the region to educate the judges. Well, it turned out for various reasons. A lot of those people were tied up, and many of them were just not interested in doing it. And in the final analysis was they were looking for somebody who didn't know that much. They were looking for a dumb shit who could come in, look at the situation fresh, and figure out a way to present it legibly to judges who were completely unfamiliar with the area and the crime scene of the case. And so I kind of said, you know, sure, I'll try. I don't think I can do this the way you want it, but I'll try. And it turned out that was what they actually wanted at that point. I couldn't figure out for the longest time why they kept asking me to come back. I'm still not really sure, but that's the way things happen, and that's the way people come up with creative solutions to address these things. That and the commitment And I've got a history with every one of these people, some of which I will not repeat because I don't want them to get thrown out or me to get thrown out. But they have been on the front lines and the forefront of trying to pick up the pieces in Bosnia and put it together again and do the good service to the fine people who suffered so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, questions, additions? I'd like to just, if there are students here, we try to start with the students. So if students have questions, okay.
Hello, Dmitro Soldatenko, Law School, SGD. I'm wondering whether any informal change with how the peace accords operate has happened over 30 years. Because, of course, I guess if I Google it now, it's the same text as was signed. But as with any institution, which seems stable, it creates discontent among different kinds of actors, and those actors usually push for like kind of incremental change, which happens like over time. So I guess the question is, can we see tectonic plates under the stable surface of the agreement moving?
Well, yeah. Why don't we take a couple of questions and then we can sort of organize the answers to that. That's a very good idea. Yeah, another student, a student or okay. Just give the students a moment. I did see three faculty and community members as well. So, okay. So Suanne, and then I saw Karima, and gentleman over there. So go ahead.
Thank you. So thank you so much for these presentations, and thank you to Bob for. That was sort of a presentation too. So, and picking up on the question of what can be done at this point, which was sort of the basis of all of your presentations. And each of you, I think, mentioned at least once the student movement that has picked up more recently. That's a cause for great optimism. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the history of student involvement and how have students in this region in particular brought about change in the past, and whether the student movement is, we've seen so many youth movements that have risen in response to particular immediate contingencies but then dissipate. And I'm wondering if there's hope that this could actually attach itself to something that has some sort of program for the future.
Great, thanks. Karima, so in the back, yeah. If you could just introduce yourself as well. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Karima Benoun. I teach human rights at the law school. I really want to thank the Donia Center for an excellent event, and I want to say how moved I was by the film and how much I hope that we never find ourselves on a train like that. The film really hit very close to home at the moment. My question maybe follows up from what Bob said. I was thinking back to being actually in Serbia and Kosovo when I was a UN Special Rapporteur in 2017 and heard many horrible stories about destruction of cultural heritage, but there were some very bright spots. And there's something I'll never forget. I met a man in Mitrovica who happened to be a Serb from Kosovo, and he was organizing this tiny little initiative to try to get Serbs and Roma people and Kosovar Albanians together to visit everybody's cultural sites all together. And it was this tiny little thing that he was doing, but it seemed so important. And then as a way of building trust, as a way of building respect and crossing all the lines. And I just wondered if you could talk about whether initiatives like that are continuing. You can also think about, say, an organization like Women in Black and the really critical role of these actors who cross borders, cross lines, and really push back against nationalism. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Karima. And one more question over here, and then we'll pool those and get some answers and do another round if there's.
My name is Bilal Bhatt. I'm from the School for Environment and Sustainability. When I see this first word in the subtitle, successes, and I was trying to find the successes in the in the panel, and I think that other than the genocide being stopped, which is of course a big success, but when you think about the architecture of Dayton and Holbrook himself and some of the other generals that were involved in Dayton, like, it was to a large extent a very self-aggrandizing process, and that Holbrook was very famously, he wanted this glory for himself. It was more about Holbrook than it was about Bosnia, was it not? Wasn't it about like him being this big peacemaker, that he wanted the glory more than anything else? And then just a sort of slight second part to that, which is, where do you see, examples of Dayton in the other Muslim genocide in Gaza today? And what can we learn from Dayton that we can apply to Gaza? And what do we look forward to Gaza at 30, so that we are not repeating the same panel questions again?
Okay, thank you very much. So we sort of have two kinds of questions. The first and last question are really focused on the agreement, the movement beneath it, a more skeptical approach to the whole process in our last question. And then the second set of questions are more about civil society, about student involvement, and small-scale initiatives to cross the line. So you can take either of those two groups or just one of them, but we'll go in reverse order this time. So Valery, you want to get us started? Yeah.
First of all, when thinking about Dayton and what it means and how people think about what it means, I think it's important to note, there's not always agreement on what it means. It's a document. It can be interpreted. And different politicians have consistently sought to emphasize or ignore different elements of it. There was a time when Milorad Dodik in the Republika Srpska hated Dayton until he learned to love Dayton because he was pushing his version of Dayton. And you can see this in general. Again, it's a floor, not a ceiling. It's a basis for moving things forward. There was never an official interpretation of the Constitution into the local language because of the fear that all of a sudden it would be too hard to get some of the nuances of some of the words. Do we mean joint or do we mean united? Stuff like that. And so there's a lot of gray area there, which on the one hand is bad, but on the other hand, it creates opportunities. And there were opportunities. There were successes, especially in the first 10 years of peace implementation. At the end of the war, there were 2 separate ministries of defense and 2 separate militaries. And after defense reform, there's now 1 Ministry of Defense and 1 Armed Forces. You can say the same about issues related to intelligence. And there were a lot of reforms made in terms of justice, in terms of boring things like taxation, etc. A lot of things needed to sort of build a state. And you know what? They've continued to hold. Now, a lot of these reforms were made when the international community was quite strong and was basically pushing heads and knocking heads and saying this needs to be done. And it was done that way. And even when some of these reforms were imposed, the parliament then did adopt them through the procedure. So there was a period of time in these institutional reforms did hold, but then a lot of the reforms stopped. And you can pretty much see when this happened. This happened in around 2007, 2008, when the Americans basically passed it off to the EU, and the EU said it's time for ownership. But the thing is a lot of these institutional reforms had not yet taken a root. I'd also point out that, you can drive around Bosnia anywhere today. And there's no checkpoints, there's no internal borders. And that's not a small thing. Having nearly 60,000 peacekeeping troops in the country starting in 1996 prevented the erection of checkpoints, prevented a Cyprus-like division. When I went to Cyprus at one point, I was shocked. I was like, oh my God, this is what Bosnia would have looked like had there not been that strong effort in 1996. And I think that was a good thing. In terms of the issue of students, I will yield in terms of talking about students in Serbia. But there were some really interesting protests in Bosnia on the streets in 2013 and 2014, when a lot of people got out on the street, and it was driven by frustration with the inability of the country's institution to deliver even the most basic tasks, and frustration with the economic situation and endemic corruption. And in both cases, while there was a lot of energy and people were really excited, and there was really, well, maybe this could be the moment that things could change, the protests fizzled out. And I mean, we have had tons of debates on this. I worry sometimes that especially a lot of these horizontal leaderless movements, which have strengths, can fizzle out if the people know what they're against but can't articulate what they're for. And that's what we're missing. That's what we've been missing in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I mean, in Serbia, I mean, there's some outlines of what people want, but knowing what you want to see is far more difficult. Is it impossible? No. There's been some interesting fora that have been held to bring people from around the country in Bosnia together through a sortition process, to sit them down and say, hey, what do you want? And people came up with some really good ideas of a mixed group. This was all funded by, it was either the EU or the Swiss, I can't remember, or both. And the EU got this. They put out a couple of tweets on a Friday afternoon saying, hey, all these citizens came up with these ideas, and they never mentioned it again. And so I asked people at the, I'm like, if you paid for this, if these ideas are good, why aren't you raising this every single day publicly with the politicians and saying, why aren't you listening to these people? They don't know why. They don't. They lack the passion to do that. They're seeing reform as a technocratic process. And they are so used to dealing with elites, they don't recognize the power that they could get just from asking people what they want to see.
Thanks. Tatjana?
Yeah. Let me start with the end of the question that was, in a way, trying to connect the situations we have now with wars, Gaza and Bosnia. And I would like to again reiterate my point that these two agreements have been completed in a different period of time, and they testify, their texts and values testified of a difference of the world we live in. Okay, Holbrooke had a big ego, right? But mostly people who have big ego are chief negotiators, and they are able to push for peace. If I would have to pick between Holbrooke and Kushner and Witkoff, I wouldn't mind the ego. I would mind having personal commercial gains out of the deal you're trying to shape. When we talk about, Gaza deal, and what we can also see in Ukraine deal. So I think that there are many lessons that can be learned from Dayton, and Valery aptly spoke about that, but I don't think that there is anyone to hear them who is willing to push for international kind of building of doable peace. Dayton was and still is a success for the people who are coming from the part of the world where there were wars. Not having a war for 30 years is a big deal. Of course, there are numerous shortcomings, but my impression was when the Dayton was built, it was built on the basis of the previous experiences that were related to Cambodia or other kind of places which had international involvement. These new deals are made mostly bilaterally, not even including a state whose future is in question, like Ukraine, if you take these American-Russian proposals for the future of Ukraine that has they confirm Ukraine's sovereignty, these kind of nonsenses and the points. So this is the messy world we live at the moment, and I think that is reflected of what we can take from the lessons of Dayton and get in today's deals. When it comes to very Dayton, of course there are, it is an instrument, that should be a living instrument, but my impression is, and Valery can correct me if I'm wrong, that these corrupt political elites, so much entrenched in their ethnicities, they're not pushing for any substantial changes and the development of the document that could serve for, like building it into something else. So you would have this dynamic of the Office of the High Representative, which is an international presence in Bosnia that would push for certain things forward. Then you would have a pushback from Republika Srpska. And then you would have these change of narratives. I was reading the address of the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in the General Assembly back in September. One portion of his speech was dedicated to Dayton. Within his narrative of Western hegemony and like double standards and stuff, some of the lines were like, they want to like overthrow the Dayton, and it's like they want to take it and make it into something else which is more functional for the people of Bosnia. So they want to keep these kind of like three ethnicities and their divides. Oh, so many questions. So maybe I can maybe now stop, give floor to Edin, and then go back to small initiatives and student protests, if there is time.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to hear actually about the student protests, but
okay, yeah.
I'll go
I
very
didn't
quickly.
continue.
Why don't we
Yeah.
take a few minutes about the students?
Sure.
and then-
Okay.
Yeah, I
okay.
think it's
okay.
a good idea.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, let's start from the current student protests in Serbia. I don't know. Probably most of you are not familiar that they started actually more than a year ago, when a newly renovated train station Konopi fell, and basically no one was held responsible. And that was one of the things that the corrupt government did in quite a while. Previous big protests, which were not student-led, but had a substantive portion of young people and people from different ideologies were related to these investments into mining industry, Rio Tinto lithium mining, which had no ecological safeguards, but the Serbian government decided to go ahead with the project, and it's like EU-pushed project, so it's really something that is also undermining you as a trusted or valued partner, because people get the idea of that they're only to use us and take our lithium that they need for electronic cars. But my point was, like, different kind of frustrations were building up to this point when 16 people died from the fall of this canopy. So basically student protests were starting asking for responsibility, and they slowly were building to reflect on deficiencies in the system related to the rule of law in more general. And they really galvanized a lot of support in Serbia. They were trying to be as inclusive as possible. They would, demand that no one would bring any flag to the protests, not the EU flag, not the US flag, not the Russian flag, so no flags. But all of a sudden you would see Russian Jesus somewhere, But basically it's like we want to be as inclusive as we can be. So we have the broader support for overthrowing the government. They knew what they were for. In a way, we want to have the rule of law. We want to have people who are responsible to really be held accountable. But what was, in a way, maybe a missed opportunity, they did not realize immediately that the only way to change the system in a democratic country is through elections. Mm-hmm. So that's why maybe this is dragging, in a way, too long. My impression is that it's not like being watered down, but the call for elections on the part of the students came only in April, and the protests were like lasting for a few months now. And then there is this underlying thing that is actually related to the story that Serbian people were sold for since 2012. And this is like, politics is nasty. You shouldn't have to do, nothing to do with that. It's very dirty. It's like you're like entering a nuclear facility and like contaminating yourself if you want to deal with that. And all opposition parties have been really so downgraded and demonized in the media that a normal single person would be shy to tell you that he or she voted for a liberal, green-leaning kind of a party because, like, he or she supported a party. I mean, political activism in Serbia has been so much demonized formalization of this that students came like to rescue. In a way, they're articulating this kind of a need for a different future. But then my fear is that once they get elections, I mean, at some point, like in mid-March, there was a peak of these protests where government also used this sonic weapon on the big demonstrations in Belgrade. If they have asked for election, probably the next day, people say they would got them, but they didn't. Never mind, we still don't have a new election. They're like preparing their list that would be an alternative to political parties. They do not still want to have anything to do with liberal opposition parties because they do not want to be contaminated by this story of like political parties being nasty and, you know, radioactive, basically. So I fear in that sense for the future of the movement, because many of the direct democratic practices they have developed were great, and really they have woken up many local communities, you know, and neighborhoods, and people just got to lean on this idea of solidarity, which is crucial. But my fear would be related to the representative democracy we need to have, because we don't have the time to run the country, all of us, every single day. So that is something that I worry about when it comes to Serbian protests. And there were previous ones. When I was a student, I participated in a protest back in 1996 when we were demonstrating against electoral fraud committed by Milosevic, and after 3 months we got special legislation that actually, after OSCE mission came to Belgrade, that actually confirmed these were the results. Those that opposition claimed that there were. So they were, you know, like they were bits and pieces back in the 1968. Probably Edin would tell you more about it, and he would know more about it. I mean, they were different in our part of the world, different protests that were relevant. But I would say 1968 resembles what is now, in sense of relevance, going on in Serbia. But hopefully it will bring more changes than 1968 in Yugoslavia.
Lasted longer than 68. Yeah, for sure.
But no one. Yeah, Vučić didn't tell students that they were right, and as Tito did too.
No.
Edin, would you like to offer some final
maybe,
thoughts on these two
maybe
questions?
Just about underlining the protest dynamics behind this, because I think as remarkable as the wave of student protest has been in Serbia, I don't want all the attention to go just to the students. I think one of the things in Bosnia, for example, that I've heard a lot about is how apathetic ordinary people are, because they are so precisely disgusted with, you know, this contaminated sphere of politics. Yeah. Politics is so dispiriting, and nothing ever gets done. Oh, thank you. But one thing that, yes, of course, there is apathy, and this kind of languishing of some of the spirit of protest in Bosnia. But at the same time, every time I go to Bosnia, especially in Sarajevo, there is a protest of some kind, a strike going on. There's a strike right now going on. The Bosnian radio television workers are on strike. Last time I was in Sarajevo, it was the medical sector. The workers were on strike. Before that, the workers in Tuzla were on strike. Before that, the students were on strike. So I don't buy into this idea that, you know, people are apathetic. Actually, people care a ton, and they're very active. And if you want to see this, and I know that as she was here, maybe a couple of months ago, Azra Hromadzic, she's a brilliant anthropologist who's written about environmental justice activism in Bosnia, about how many women in small villages, in small towns, have gathered, mobilized, all on their own, no EU input, no, you know, NGO charter, to stop the building of mini dams in places you've never heard of. And that doesn't make, you know, the New York Times or whatever, NPR, you know, in the rest of the world. But I think it's extremely meaningful and really important. And you see actually some of these linkages happening regionally. Environmental justice activism in Bosnia, linking up with activists in Croatia, in Serbia, in neighboring countries as well. So I would much more focus on that, because I think, to maybe very briefly address your question about the institutional or informal change that you mentioned underneath the surface, maybe not so much success stories. I don't know what success means in this context, but certainly there are positive developments of that kind. There were many positive developments that Valery mentioned in the first 10 years of after Dayton. In the last 10 years, I think in Sarajevo, educational workers have received proportional raises so they can actually make a living. If you're faculty at the university, to stop the brain drain. Maybe it won't work as well as it's promised, but things like that are happening. And the Dayton Constitution does bind Bosnia to international human rights standards, to the ICC, to the cooperation with the ICTY and its residual mechanisms. That really matters for women's activism, for groups that previously were not able to publicly speak. There's Sarajevo Open Center, which just recently published an incredible book on history of queer lives in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think, is that a success story in Dayton, Bosnia? I don't know if it's a success. I love it. It's a fantastic thing that is done not by Europeans. It didn't come from abroad, or somebody planted this idea. This is truly a local initiative that people are doing. Final point, since I mentioned the ICCY about Gaza, I think this is maybe the moment where Valery spoke about the death of the liberal order. That is, maybe that was last seen alive somewhere in the rubble of Gaza. I think if you are looking for a place where it's truly gone, it is there. And to be clear about it, I don't think that it's the doing of the Trump administration. Biden delegitimated the ICC indictment of Benjamin Netanyahu. If we want to talk about gravediggers, and then when the grave gets filled by the next guy that comes along, but we have to talk not just about the Palestine exception, so it's not just progressive accept Palestine. I think it's a much more deeper structural problem of that old liberalism. It's that kind of lesser evilism that I mentioned. Oh, great, Dayton ended the war. Let's count that as a success story. Okay, that's not enough. I remember Bill Clinton speaking like how he remembered how pained the president of Bosnia, Alija Izetbegović, was before agreeing to sign the Dayton Peace Accords. But then that he told Clinton that he did because it wasn't a just peace, but it's better than war. And Clinton tells this with a smile, to somebody whose people underwent a genocide. The disparity in that clip when I saw it was wild to me, right? So it's not just progressive accept Palestine. There was a profound flaw in that old liberal order that was apparent. If you had eyes, Palestinians have been saying that for decades. I don't know if it's time to rebuild that liberal order or if it's time for something new that is called different, but some kind of commitment to, basic things like human dignity of everyone, and everyone means everyone. Consequences for adjudicating war crimes, whether they're done for everyone. I think these are very, very basic things that America has been failing at for a long time. And not just in Gaza, but nobody in the U.S. government was sentenced for the Iraq War. I think about that a lot. I'll just end it there.
Okay, well, thank you to all three of our terrific panelists. We've reached the end of our time, and I just would encourage you to continue the conversations bilaterally. We had some food, but it seems to have arbitrarily disappeared in the last few minutes. I don't quite know what happened to it, but is it out in the hall, or did they literally take it? Okay, that's too bad. So I hope you'll at least linger for the conversation, but thanks very much for staying for what was a really monumental event.